Let me tell you a story that you've probably already heard before. In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus, a Genoese explorer, reached the shores of an island in the Caribbean. The original reason for his voyage was to find a western route to India across the Atlantic. So at first, he thought he had landed on a small island just off the coast of Japan, when in fact, he was the first European since Leif Erikson, nearly half a millennium earlier, to reach what would later become known as the New World. When Columbus and his crew realized this, they saw opportunity. So he wrote back to his patrons, the King and Queen of Spain, that he had found a land that couldn't be found on any previous European map, and they saw the same thing. More expeditions would follow, carrying Spanish soldiers, the conquistadors, led by men like Hernan Cortes and Francisco Pizarro. They would go on to conquer vast areas of Central and Southern America, toppling mighty empires like those of the Aztec and the Inca. Not long after, other European powers, mainly Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, would also establish their own colonies in the New World: North America, South America, and the Caribbean. Over the centuries, those colonies would grow to encompass the entire New World. Eventually, each of them would win their independence, and today, almost all the people who live in the New World speak either English, Spanish, Portuguese, with a little bit of Dutch and French sprinkled in there in places like Quebec and Suriname. This is the story that you were likely told in your primary and secondary education, and while it isn't factually incorrect per se, it is clearly condensed to fit into a packed historical curriculum and simplified to be easily understood by children and teenagers. The nuances of how the different European powers treated their subjects in the New World and how they went about their colonization, as well as the vast differences in culture between the many different native peoples that inhabited the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans, are often glossed over in school classrooms. And they are definitely way beyond the scope of this video, though there is a lot of very great literature written by fantastic authors and historians on the subject, and I would highly encourage that anyone who is interested educate themselves. But this video will mainly be talking about the early colonization of the Spanish Americas and how and why it happened the way that it did. And to do so, we will be looking at a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by American author Jared Diamond. Now, this is a very famous and popular and influential work. It even won a Pulitzer Prize in '97, and that's because it seeks to very ambitiously answer a question that anyone who has studied the history of the early modern period up to today will have asked themselves: how come some nations, some societies, some groups of people tend to dominate and influence others, while others tend to have influence exerted upon them? What are the factors that determine this? And more specifically for this period, how come Europe was able to develop and establish this global political and economic hegemony through colonization? This theory is called geographic determinism, and it basically states that any large historical development or event can be traced back to environmental factors, as I said earlier. Now, the primary purpose of this model is that it refutes the earlier ideas that colonial powers had to explain why they were able to create such large empires. The racist pseudoscience that claims that white Europeans are just genetically inherently better or smarter, and that is the natural order that they should rule over the lesser races, which is obviously bullshit, and it's good to call that out. But by reducing every historical development to mere geography, there's another unintended consequence that arises from that. The answer that Jared Diamond arrives at is very clear: environmental factors. Eurasia has many useful metals in the ground, like iron, which made them develop advanced metallurgy, and steel, which helped them conquer the Americas. They had horses that they could use for cavalry, which also gave them an edge. They had many domesticatable animals, like cows, pigs, and sheep that weren't native to the Americas, which meant that many plagues that started out as animal diseases developed in Europe and Eurasia. So when they came over to the Americas, those diseases that they brought over with them ravaged the native population who had no immunity to any of it. Namely, that it destroys all sense of human agency that these people who lived through this historical period had. History becomes no longer the story of human beings who lived and strived and created their societies, but about simple nature and geography, which predetermined everything that was going to happen. It was inevitable. It was inevitable that the natives were going to get conquered. Their resistance was futile. It was inevitable, as soon as the Europeans landed, that the diseases were going to wipe out 90% of the native population. By completely disregarding the human element when trying to find the causes for these events, we also destroy the possibility of any responsibility that could be carried for these atrocities. The individuals responsible for this conquest and the systems that they enacted, the conquistadors and their encomiendas, are almost reduced to footnotes, unimportant in comparison to the so-called real inhuman causes for the vast deaths that swept across the Americas in the wake of the Spanish conquest. Of course, I'm not trying to completely diminish the importance of geographical factors, but while it is true that Europeans had some inherent geographic advantages compared to the Native Americans, there is also a reason why it was specifically the Spanish who so quickly conquered large parts of Central and South America. Not just because it was them who first commissioned Columbus's expedition. It's not like they were able to keep the secret of the New World secret from the other new powers, great powers in Europe for long, but also because a centuries-long religious conflict known as the Reconquista had just ended on the Iberian Peninsula, which left a large social class of professional soldiers and lower nobility with no land, who didn't have much to do and were hungry to go and adventure and conquer new lands for the Spanish crown and for themselves, even if it was on the other side of an ocean. The Reconquista also taught those Spanish soldiers how to form treaties with foreign entities of different religions, because while Muslims and Christians often and most often fought each other during the Reconquista, they also sometimes fought on the same side. And that experience came especially in handy because the large, mighty Aztec and Inca empires had only grown to their current size fairly recently when the Spanish arrived. So a lot of recently conquered natives would gladly fight for the Spanish against their perceived oppressors. While it was inevitable that the Europeans would unintentionally spread their diseases to the New World as soon as they landed, there were other factors behind the massive demographic shock that was felt throughout the continent. Human factors. Pestilence was but one of the four horsemen that ravaged the Spanish Americas. War was another, not only the initial conquest, but also the violence with which the Spanish put down any sort of rebellion from the native population, which inevitably propped up across their territories. Because of the massive famine that was created when the natives' agricultural systems were disrupted, because men were being forcibly sent to work in silver mines, where also their working conditions were terrible and there was massive death. The encomienda system, which was famously criticized by Bartolomé de las Casas, who himself used to be a conquistador, reduced the natives to indentured servants, which were ruthlessly exploited for the economic gain of those who ruled over them, who then were only concerned with extracting as much wealth as they could and bringing it back to Spain, and not with the well being of their subjects. But hey, at least they stopped the human sacrifices, am I right? The Spanish bringers of civilization would never do something as barbaric as ritually murdering someone to appease their god. It might seem like I'm being very harsh on the Spanish right now. Of course, other colonial powers did committed atrocities that were just as worse, or even way worse. Just look at my home country, Belgium. But I wanted to use the Spanish conquest as an example for what I'm saying, not just because I've seen a lot of terrible takes and memes surrounding it going around the internet, but also because of the deterministic view around it, which is probably well intentioned most of the time, but can still be harmful, I feel. The natives were not just helpless victims waiting for their inevitable doom at the hands of the Spanish. There is no such thing as an inevitable outcome in history. If geography could be used to accurately predict what was going to happen, then we could predict the future using history. But we can't, because we humans are ultimately in charge of our own destiny, and that would always be the case. The decisions that we make as individuals and as societies, however small they may seem in the grand scheme of things, do affect the course of history for good or for ill. And so we should be mindful, both when looking towards the past and when looking towards the present and the future.